Well, good evening to everyone. We are happy to see you here. Thankful that you had an opportunity to come back and be with us for our 5 o'clock Bible study. Of course, we just had our devotional, now our Bible study, and we're thankful that you're here, thankful that you're able to be here, and welcome those who are joining us online as well. We thank you for being a part of the class. And, of course, we had a lot of college-age students with us tonight with, I guess, tonight the final Songs of Summer and getting ready to go to that a little later on. It's always good to see so many young people with a desire to come together for such an effort and such a purpose. And so we're ready now. We wrapped up our study last week at the church of Philippi. And now we're ready to begin in Acts 17 with the church at Thessalonica as we're going through churches in the New Testament, looking at churches in the New Testament. So we're ready to begin in Acts chapter 17 with the church at Thessalonica. Thessalonica is located in Macedonia, part of the area of Macedonia. We'll go ahead and go to our map and show that. Of course, you're familiar with the maps. You've looked at them all of your life and studying the Bible. This is a map showing Paul's first and second missionary journeys, and we know that the church at Thessalonica was established on his second missionary journey. You remember going back to our study a few weeks ago, Paul is with Silas. He leaves with Silas from Antioch. Silas joined Paul because of their conversation or conference down in Jerusalem over circumcision. Silas was one of the ones who goes back to Antioch. Barnabas and Paul have a disagreement over John Mark, so Barnabas and John Mark go to Cyprus. Paul and Silas take off on what we call the second missionary journey, and we see that Timothy will join them. Paul is forbidden to preach the gospel in much of the area that he wants to preach in Asia Minor. They send them on over to Philippi, and in Troas is where Luke joined them. So a group of 4, Paul, Silas, Timothy, and Luke, will travel on the Philippi. And that's what we discussed over the last 4 weeks, was the church at Philippi. And as Acts chapter 16 comes to an end, Paul and Silas were beaten and placed into prison for overnight, converted to Philippian jailer. And then they're released, and immediately in Acts chapter 17, and we're going to begin tonight in Acts 17, they'll make their way down to Thessalonica, and thus help to begin the church in Thessalonica. So we see it's an area in Macedonia, just as was Philippi, as well as Berea. We've already studied Berea. We're not necessarily studying these in order of the book of Acts, but we are trying to cover all the churches and just looking at different churches in the New Testament. So we've already actually looked at Berea, but before Berea, they came to Thessalonica. So we'll be going back to the map a number of times tonight as we have our introduction to this church. The Macedonian king Cassander named it in honor of his wife Thessalonice, and she was a half-sister of Alexander the Great. So that's the area that you are in. Taking the gospel to Thessalonica, as I mentioned a moment ago, upon leaving Philippi, while on the second missionary journey, Paul and Silas traveled to Thessalonica. So let's go ahead and begin in Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17 and verse 1 beginning. This is what I just mentioned a moment ago. And we see in Acts chapter 17 and verse 1, now when there's that word to key in on. That lets us know that at this particular time, Luke did not travel with them. Luke, the writer of the book of Acts. So they were traveling on, and they come to Thessalonica. Now we're going to talk a little more in just a moment about who all was together when they left Philippi. I put on the notes that it was Paul and Silas. Perhaps Timothy was with them, perhaps not. We'll discuss that a little more in just a moment. So they leave Philippi, and they come to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And that's a difference that we see right off the bat from when they arrived in Philippi. Philippi did not mention the synagogue. Philippi just had them going out on the Sabbath day to meet with Lydia and these group of women by the riverside. But in Thessalonica, there is a synagogue of the Jews. In verse 2, then Paul, as his custom was, went into them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. Notice how often Luke emphasizes women throughout the book of Acts. It's quite often that he does so, and he emphasizes their role and their importance. And that's something that we need not overlook, because a lot of times the Christianity in general, and certainly the Lord's church, can get a bad name saying that we do not respect our women, and that should not be the case at all. The Lord's church is dependent upon faithful women, just the same as faithful men. And so Luke mentions that in verse 4 once again. A great multitude of devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women joined with Paul and Silas. As I mentioned, you're not going to read Timothy's name until you get down to verse 14 in Berea. Now, some think that maybe Timothy was with them, that he too went with them from Philippi down to Thessalonica. I personally don't think he did. I'm not sure why Luke would have not included his name here had he went with them to Thessalonica. So he mentions only Paul and Silas. It seems to me that Timothy and Luke would have stayed behind in Philippi. So this is a part of the second missionary journey, and we know for sure that you have Paul and Silas traveling down to Thessalonica together. And so remember, you're still kind of new in this journey. The journey started back in chapter 16. They make their way to Philippi. It's still kind of a new journey. They've been on it for many, many weeks now, but yet it's somewhat new. So there you find them going into Thessalonica, going to the synagogue, going there on the Sabbath day, reasoning with the Jews. Paul teaches us how to be evangelists and go to where the people are who believe. It's not to say that we should neglect atheists or anything like that, but there's a great work among those who believe and just helping them to understand a little more about what the Bible says. I'll never forget Ted Burleson, who was with us on our first night of summer series. I'll never forget, he said in class, he said, I'd rather go anywhere in this world if the gospel had already been there. Even if they're not New Testament Christians, I'd rather them have some knowledge about God and the Bible. Everyone in the class disagreed with them, including myself. I said, no, we'd rather them not have all those different ideas and doctrines taught to them. Then I started traveling the world. I'd much rather have them already believing in God and the Bible. If you're that far, that's great. If you can start out with them already believing in God and the Bible, then you can just go the rest of the way and teaching them what truth is. So it's not to neglect any group of people or any believer or non-believer, but here he is with the Jews, those who already had the Scriptures, those who were already followers of God. They just needed to learn that Christ certainly was the fulfillment of these Scriptures. Because of the persecution from the Jews, their stay in Thessalonica was not long. In Acts chapter 17, let's go back and read verse 4 again. Some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. But then the very next verse, notice the very next verse, verse 5. But the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, These who have turned the world upside down have come here too. Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar. saying there's another king, Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Then in verse 10, then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night. So again, you see only Paul and Silas. I think Timothy remained in Philippi. But, there's not much to say about the church here. Of course, we have 2 books to the Thessalonians that we'll get into perhaps tonight, perhaps next week. We'll see how it goes. But just a few verses, just about 9 verses, and then in verse 10, they have to send them on the way to Berea. So we learn that that Paul went, and he's reasoning with them for at least 3 Sabbaths. He's teaching them the Word of God. He does not give us as much detail here as the church in Philippi or the church at Ephesus, but certainly we know that it would have started the same way. To become Christians, they would have had to do the same thing that the people in Philippi had to do, or the people in Ephesus will do, or the people in Corinth will do. So, Paul then will have to find another way to help this new congregation to become grounded in the faith and begin maturing. And that's what you have to really appreciate about this great man of God. Because, okay, so here's a block. He goes in and he's teaching, he's establishing the Lord's church, and some receive it, some do not. And so he and Silas, they think it's best to send them on their way, send them on to Berea. And so what, is he just going to give up on them? Is he just going to say, no, that's a lost cause? Certainly not. We talked a little bit about this, the church at Philippi. When we begin a work, we need to pray about it. We need to plan it out. We need to ask, what are we going to do? And, we also need to be determined that sometimes it might not go the way that we plan for it to go. And what are we going to do then? We can't just give up. And that's what you see out of the Apostle Paul. He does not give up. Certainly, I would think, just knowing his character that we read about in the New Testament, that he would have wanted to stay and help them grow a little, help them a little more. But that's not able. He's not able to do that at this time because of the persecution by the Jews. So they send them away to Berea. In Berea, Timothy joined Paul and Silas. So we've read Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 10. Paul and Silas go to Thessalonica. They're there in the synagogue on Sabbath day. They're reasoning with the Jews. Others do not care for it. They're going to bring harm to them, try to at least. And then in verse 10, they're to Berea. We've already looked at verses, in previous studies, we've already looked at verses 10 through 13, the church at Berea. And so they're there. Those in Berea were more noble, more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica. They're searching the Scriptures daily. But you get down to verse 14, pertaining to our study tonight, we see Timothy joins them once again. Then immediately, let's go back to verse 13. Let's go back to verse 13. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds. Can we go back to our map for just a moment? So you see, Thessalonica and Berea, they're not too far. They're not too far apart. So Paul, it seems as if Paul left Luke and Timothy in Philippi at the end of Acts 16. He and Silas make their way to Thessalonica to begin the church there. Persecution pushes he and Silas on to Berea, but he's in Berea when Jews from Thessalonica come down to cause trouble there. Trouble will follow you. That's something we must know as Christians. We must realize as Christians, trouble will follow us. Trouble. We talked about that this morning. And sin and trouble, it will follow us, and it'll try to destroy us. You think Satan's not trying to destroy this congregation? You think Satan's not trying to destroy your family? Satan's trying to find a way in, and he's going to do anything he can to do so. You think he's not trying to destroy the Lord's church all over the world? And trouble will follow. Trouble will do what it can to find you. So he's in Berea with Silas, and Jews from Thessalonica come. And so going back to our notes, we see that Timothy is now with them. Verse 13, Jews from Thessalonica learn, so they come there to stir up the crowds there in Berea. In verse 14, then immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So you see Timothy in Berea. At what point did Timothy travel with them or meet up with them? I don't know that the Bible really tells us, but we do find him in Berea in verse 14. In verse 15, so those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. So let's go back to our map again. I'm going to work you tonight a little bit. So they're in Berea. We find all three of them in Berea in verse 14 of Acts chapter 17. Paul, Timothy, and Silas. They send Paul all the way down to Athens. So Paul makes his way to Athens, leaving Silas and Timothy behind in Berea. So then, in verse 15, again, we just read it again. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed. At some point, in Berea, Timothy joined Paul and Silas, as we just read in chapter 17, verses 14 and 15. At some point, Timothy goes to Thessalonica to help the new church. This is where we have to bounce back and forth a little bit in our Bible. So go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Now, I've given you all the notes. It can be a little confusing if we're not careful, because we have to go back and forth and try to put a few verses together to see everything that's going on. But you have the notes, and I'll try to explain it in an understandable way. What we know from what we've read is Timothy is with Paul and Silas in Berea. Paul is then sent to Athens, and in Athens Paul calls for Silas and Timothy to meet him. But at some point, Timothy goes to the church at Thessalonica to help this new church. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, this is Paul writing to the church at Thessalonica, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith. So at some point or another, Paul would send Timothy to Thessalonica to help this new church. Remember, I said a moment ago, I said, Paul's likely what would have been his plans to continue on and to work there a little longer to help this new church, with the Jews in this uproar against him. They stopped that, and Paul had to move on. So then, what we see is Paul finding a way. And again, I think that's very important that we realize that in the church today. Let's find a way. Let's find a way to do what we can do. And it might not be, I might not be the one to do it. There are some areas of the world that it'd be very difficult for me to go to because I'm an American. But there are other Christians from other countries that can get in and out easily. So let's find a way. Let's find a way, And so that's important that we realize that. At some point, Timothy goes to Thessalonica to help this new church. Paul knew that they needed the encouragement from this man. The Bible does not give every detail of Silas and Timothy traveling from Berea to Athens and then back to Macedonia. Okay? So we know that they're in Berea. We know that Paul gets to Athens and calls for them. It doesn't. If you go back to Acts 17, the Bible does not tell us that we do not see them arriving in Athens. But he called for them. But then we know 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, he sends them back to Macedonia. Okay, so the Bible does not give every detail of Silas and Timothy traveling from Berea to Athens and then back to Macedonia. From reading the previous verses, it seems that these men joined Paul in Athens. Then he sent them back to Macedonia, Timothy to Thessalonica and Silas to Philippi. And after a period of time at these locations, they would later travel from Macedonia to meet Paul in Corinth after he departed from Athens. So let's go back to our map once again. So then, just to try to keep us on target here in establishing the church at Thessalonica, they're in Berea together. The three of them are in Berea together. Paul gets sent to Athens and immediately calls for Timothy and Silas to join him. It seems as if they did. It seems as if they traveled to join him. From reading 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, we know that Paul from Athens would send Timothy back to Thessalonica. And from what we're about to read in Acts chapter 18, we've not read it yet, but what we're about to read in Acts chapter 18, we see that Silas would have went back to Macedonia as well. Because Silas and Timothy will later meet Paul down here in Corinth. So I know it's a lot to follow, but we'll just stay with me and we'll put it all together. So we'll find that Timothy goes back to Thessalonica, which is in Macedonia. Silas goes somewhere in Macedonia, likely Philippi, and we'll discuss that. So let's go to Acts 18. Acts 18. This is all in helping to establish the church at Thessalonica. You see the work and the labor that went into it with these men and their desire to help the Lord's church. So in Acts 18, the rest of Acts 17, Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through the end of the chapter is Paul in Athens alone. And I read something this past week, and I never really thought about it. This is the first time in Paul's journeys, this is the first time with Paul that you find him alone. His first journey, he was always with Barnabas. And in his second journey, he's always with other people up to this point. So this is the first time that you find Paul alone when he is in Athens. So there's not much in the way of the work that we're concerned about in Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 34. But in Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, that is important to our study tonight. In Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And then in verse 2, he finds Aquila and Priscilla. They're tent makers. They're working together. He reasoned. Notice verse 4. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. That was his custom. That's what he would do. So they had a synagogue there. They had Jews there. He persuaded both Jews and Greeks. And notice verse 5. This comes back into play for our study. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. So, jump back to our map one more time. We see that while in Athens, it seems that Silas and Timothy would have been with them. And from 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. But at some point, perhaps with Timothy, Silas had to go back as well. Did Silas go to Thessalonica? Maybe, maybe not. Did he go there for a period of time and then move somewhere else? The Bible doesn't say. But he had to go back to Macedonia in order to one of these churches in Macedonia, in order for him to come from Macedonia and meet Paul in Corinth. So Paul, at the beginning of Acts 18, leaves Athens, goes to Corinth. Timothy and Silas come from Macedonia, meet him in Corinth. And that's important, not because we're studying the church at Corinth tonight, but it is from here that Paul gets a report on this young church of the Thessalonians, and this is where he'll write the first letter to them. So that's where we're getting to. That's why we're discussing all this. From Corinth, he'll write this letter to them. Many people believe that Silas went to Philippi, and here's why I'm not getting ahead of myself. The Bible does not say, if we go back to our notes, the Bible does not say that Silas' Macedonia journey was to Philippi. However, Silas and Timothy arrived in Corinth with financial aid for Paul. It's likely that the giving church in Philippi sent this to Paul. So if you go back to Acts chapter 18 and verse 5, you see that Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia. Now jump over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 9. Paul says to the church at Corinth, "And when I was present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one. For what I lacked, the brethren who came from Macedonia supplied." So we discussed this in the last couple of weeks when we talked about the church at Philippi. That giving church, that loving church. We know if you read Philippians chapter 4, we'll not go back to read all of it. I do want to read some of it, so jump over there real quick to Philippians 4. Philippians 4. We'll not read verses 10 through 20 tonight. We've already discussed that. Paul talking about their generosity and helping him in his effort and in the work that he was doing. But notice what he says in verse 15. Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent aid once and again for my necessities. So, from these two verses, we see that when Paul leaves Philippi, makes his way to Thessalonica, they send aid. And we talked a little bit about that, the church at Philippi. You know, Luke gives us indicators of how they were able to do this. Lydia had a profession where she could have made good money in her profession. The Philippian jailer lends way to letting us know that he would have had a little bit of money. So this church had the right attitude. They send him support in Thessalonica. But did you key in on what he said in verse 14? I think it was Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15. I meant. Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church shared with me concerning giving and receiving, but you only. So it's a common thought that when you see Silas and Timothy arriving in Corinth in Acts chapter 18 and verse 5, and you see that brethren from Macedonia sent the support to him, that it would have come from Philippi. So the Bible doesn't say that Silas went to Philippi, but you put these together and there's pretty good indication that he did. We have a little more to discuss on this, but I also want to kind of transition and focus on Timothy with our next point. So before I do that, are there any questions or comments? I know this is kind of just introductory stuff. She kind of showing us the path of getting the church in Thessalonica started. But are there any questions or comments before I go to our next point?
It was over time that all those trips back and forth happened by sea, because even your map says that it looks like it's greater than 150 miles from Macedonia to Athens and back again.
Right.
One way.
Right.
It must have been over some time.
Right. Talking about the time. Go back to the map just one more time. Kathy's talking about the time that it was taken. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this didn't happen overnight, to make these journeys, And we know in Thessalonica he was there for at least 3 weeks. At least 3 weeks he was there because he reasoned with them for 3 Sabbaths. Now, he'll talk later about laboring with them night and day. Some people think he could have been there for a couple of months, 2 or 3 months. Some people think that's a possibility. So when I say he wasn't there long, it's certainly not to say that he was just there a day or two. I'm not saying that at all. But he wasn't, when you're beginning a new church, even 2 or 3 months is not a long time. That's why we're here tonight. We're obeying God, but we're also growing and developing in our faith. And so when you're beginning a new work, it's important that you work with them. And yeah, you see the commitment just into traveling back and forth. Just into traveling back and forth. And here's the thing. They run out of Philippi. They're beaten and thrown in prison in Philippi. So they don't give up and go home. They go to Thessalonica and start the congregation. And so they're run out of there by the Jews. They don't give up and go home. They go to Berea and start a congregation. And so they run out of Berea. They don't give up and go home. They go to Athens and then to Corinth and start a congregation. There's nothing you can do to stop these guys. And that's a beautiful attitude. Beautiful. You might hurt them. You might hinder them. When I first started preaching, my uncle said you can never be fired as a preacher. He said you might be told where you can't preach, but you can never be fired as a preacher. He said you can always preach to someone somewhere. And, that's the thing. That's the beauty of it. When you see their commitment in the face of danger and in the face of persecution at every turn, they don't stop. They don't quit. We need to have a greater faith in God than the unbelievers have in whatever they want to believe in. That's a good point. There's a lot of time and commitment in this traveling back and forth. I heard a missionary He passed just a few years ago in his 90s, but he said in his younger years they would travel to Africa. And I remember hearing him say, take a boat over 28 days. And I thought, 28 days on a boat to get there? I'm not going to complain about a 24-hour flight or 30-hour flight, if you can get there. And it took him 28 days by boat to get there. Appreciate that commitment so very, very much. Notice the next point, if we go back, I want to be sure to cover that tonight. How much confidence, there we are, point 2. How much confidence did the Apostle Paul have in the young Timothy to send him to the den of persecution in Thessalonica alone? Now think about this. You have to really think about what's going on. Paul and Silas have to leave Thessalonica because of persecution of the Jews. Some of these very Jews followed them to Berea and run them out of Berea. But Paul, we know from reading 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, he sends Timothy there, perhaps alone, probably alone. Maybe Silas went with him. Maybe Silas went with him for a period of time and then went to Philippi. But either way, remember, this younger man Timothy, sometimes you have to ask yourself, what is the Bible saying that it doesn't say? I'm not talking about adding to it and changing it or anything like that. I'm not saying that at all. But you put it all together, the persecution that they received, and now Paul is sending him back to Thessalonica. That says a lot about Timothy. That's a lot. This young man was trained very well to do the Lord's work before he ever met Paul. Remember, we don't meet Timothy until Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. He was trained very well. So who was it that took time to prepare Timothy for this work? Let me do this. Jump to the next slide quickly because we're down to 9 minutes. And I don't want to leave us hanging in a bad spot for next week. So Paul would later return to Macedonia on his 3rd missionary journey. Although not said specifically in the Bible, it's very likely that Paul would have visited the brethren in Thessalonica on this trip. Acts chapter 20 and verse 1. I did not want to leave that part hanging until next week. So we do see Macedonia on Paul's 3rd missionary journey. Thessalonica is not mentioned specifically, but certainly you would think that it would have included that trip. So let's go back to our previous slide, and we'll spend the last 9 minutes talking a little bit about Timothy. Here, again, I think this just really, I never really thought about it like this until this particular lesson. He sends them back. So Acts chapter 16 and verse 1. So Acts 15, the end of Acts 15 is when Paul and Barnabas have their disagreement and they go separate ways. Paul takes Silas and the 2nd missionary journey begins. In Acts chapter 16 and verse 1, then Paul came to Derbe and Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy. There's our introduction to Timothy. The son of a certain Jewish woman who believed, but his father was Greek. So again, in our notes, I asked the question, who had this man prepared? Who had this man prepared, and you know the answer, but who had this man prepared to where Paul saying, hey, take him with me. Remember, what was the disagreement about at the end of the previous chapter? Paul had an issue with John Mark. Paul didn't want John Mark traveling with him anymore. Later, Paul would overcome that, 2 Timothy chapter 4, and he could see the value in Mark. But we have to remember, Paul, again, I don't think just anybody could travel with Paul. And here, he meets this young man and says, hey, I want you to go with me. And he takes him with him. And they go to Troas, they go to Philippi. So go to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5. I have to tie in the importance of the family anytime I can. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, the Bible says that we just read in Acts chapter 16 and verse 1 about his father being a Greek that indicates his father's not a believer. 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 5, Paul writing to the younger Timothy, his last letter of inspiration, says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, I am persuaded is in you also. You've read that verse, you've heard that verse, you've used this verse. Oh, Timothy, What a joy it is to see the home life of his mom and his grandmother teaching him the Scriptures. And we usually talk about that, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. And that from childhood you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. So you look at these two verses and you think, man, that's great. His mom taught him, his grandmother taught him. He traveled with Paul. He knew it from a childhood. But you think back to what we're talking about in Acts 17, Acts 18, and 1 Thessalonians 3, and you think, wait a minute, this guy was really strong in his faith. Strong enough that Acts 16, Paul wanted him to travel with him. Strong enough that Paul says, I can send you there without me. You know, the church, salvation is in the church, Ephesians 5:23. Very important what we're doing. I'm so grateful that we have our children in class tonight and those who are teaching our children. But we need some moms like Eunice. We need some moms and grandmoms like Lois. We need dads too, of course. I'm not taking away from that. But where's the next generation of Bible teachers? Where's the next generation of deacons? Where's the next generation of elders? Where's the next generation of preachers? Where's the next generation of song leaders? Where's the next generation of personal workers? Where is the next generation of missionaries? You know, so very important. They had him prepared. They had him prepared to travel with this man. They had him prepared that he could go in to Thessalonica and help this infant church, this new church. Quickly, Titus chapter 2, and I want to try to leave you a minute or two if you have any thoughts. Titus chapter 2, in verse 3, the older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. That they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands. The word of God may not be blasphemed. So this is just one of the little sections of Scripture that would remind us of the importance of men and women, but focusing on Timothy's mother and grandmother and focusing on the older teaching the younger, how important that is. You know, there's a lot to say when Paul is willing to send Timothy to Thessalonica, to send him to this place where they'd received such persecution. A lot to say about him. What thoughts or comments? Well, my last thought, I don't even know if it's on the PowerPoint or not, but Paul was always looking for faithful co-workers, and he was willing to use them. Timothy, Silas, Aquila, it didn't matter. He was willing to use them. We need to always be looking for people who, look, if you can give me somebody who's willing to work, we'll find a job. We'll find work in the church. If you have a willing mind, guarantee you there's something for you to do. That's all we need is a willing mind. Okay, what thoughts or comments do you have before the bell catches us?
I can just imagine that his mother and grandmother, when they learned about the work he was doing, just how very pleased they were. He was holding on to the faith, and not only that, he was out teaching others, and so I can just imagine, where they were, what they were thinking about the work he's done. And just one other thing, in this day and age, and for I don't know, several decades now, I've run into a number of folks at various places who are very dismissive of older folks. And that just grates on my nerves to no end. And I think all too often some of our older saints are very quick to not, to kind of hang out in the background and not do the work that is there to do.
Sure. Great point. Kevin mentions, Timothy's mom and grandmother, and certainly had to be pleased with the work he was doing and going out and teaching others, and the greatest work that they could ever train him to do. But also the importance of younger generation respecting the older generation, learning from them, and the older generation teaching the younger. Yeah, absolutely, teaching the younger. There's we need to be sure that we're doing all we can to not allow a generational gap to hinder the Lord's work. And again, I think that's on both sides as well. Willing to see the value in in all and work together. Well, the bell called us. Next week, Lord willing, will already be August, will it not? Is next Sunday, is it August the 1st? Am I correct or am I wrong? Am I a false teacher? I'm correct. Next Sunday is August the 1st. Wow, this year's going by, is it not? Next Sunday, Lord willing, we will get into the book and look a little more at the. I know the background took a lot of time, I know, but I thought that was important. We'll get into the book next week and look at the church at Thessalonica. So glad to have Will and Jenna here with us. Jenna, correct? Okay, glad to have Will and Jenna. I kept wanting to say Jana, but Will and Jenna. So glad to have them with us here tonight. Be sure to see them before you go. Have a great day, great evening, great night.